watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
So what we've done today is assembled a dialogue between two perspectives, not necessarily polar opposites for sure, but just bringing two perspectives onto the subject. One perspective takes a historical perspective, that of Rabbi Lance Sussman, and he will offer you kind of a history of belonging, a history of membership in the United States, in the American Jewish community. And Rabbi Edythe Mencher, who will talk about the kind of psychodynamic of membership, the psychodynamic of belonging. That is to say, even if the membership institutions that exist today don't exist tomorrow, what are the kinds of institutions, the kinds of things that will respond to the needs of belonging, the needs of participation that we have?
I would say that we're at a different moment today than has been the case historically. Most of the factors that brought people to a synagogue or even communal membership I would characterize as extrinsic. For example, class. We don't like to talk about class in the United States. It's an important category of analysis. If you take a sociology class or a history class, you're going to hear a lot about the dynamics of class, and particularly the dynamics of the elite in a society. Class has had a very important role in structuring our communal institutions and membership in them as well. I would say that providing ethnic markers, even more than spirituality per se, historically, has been one of the major functions of Jewish affiliation in the United States, in large part because of the unusual side-by-side arrangement of the secular and the religious in American society. We're simultaneously one of the most religious and most secular societies all at the same time. I think in the Jewish community, historically, there has been an effort to represent ourselves externally to the general American public as a religious community, although internally the majority mostly behave along ethnic and familiar lines as opposed to actually embracing Judaism as a religion. Within that world, I would say the Landeslight principle narrowly, if you came from a certain town in Bavaria in the 1830s, you would look for people of the same origin to be in touch with them, has been a major factor. Certainly the same is true among East European Jews. So you have Landeslight as an important extrinsic factor. And finally, and very importantly and enduring, in my opinion, using the Jewish community to find a way to represent American values through the Jewish community, that we have a way of taking Americanistic principles, Americanistic practices, make them a part of the synagogue and declaring them Jewish. It is a way of participating in the larger society, but using the symbols of Judaism. If we're worried about Jewish religious behavior today and a perceived decline in Jewish religious behavior today, I wouldn't worry all that much about it. The first major scholar of the colonial Jewish experience, our teacher, Jacob Marcus, defined the religion of colonial American Jews as the orthodoxy of salutary neglect. In other words, Judaism has been, for almost 4 centuries, the religion that Jews in America have chosen not to practice. Okay, and this is nothing new in American history. Jewish ritual behavior, with the exception of some very deep pockets here and there, has generally been very, very low. This was a frontier society. It did not attract elites from the Jewish religious community in Europe. In fact, at certain points, the rabbis of the great yeshivas told their followers not to settle in America. They explicitly said, do not come to America. If you come to America, you will solve the problems of your body, that you will no longer be persecuted or poor, but your grandchildren won't be Jewish. So don't come to America. And the East European Jews did exactly what Jews have always done. They didn't listen to the rabbis and then named their yeshivas after the people who told them not to come here to America. The religion of the Republic plays a very important role in framing Jewish religiosity. I would say that the theology that is closest to the religion of the Republic is deism. Deism is an 18th century way of looking at the world, the cosmos, and God. It's a belief that philosophically there is a God, but that God has nothing to do with the world. I don't think that the American problem of religion is God. The American problem of religion is God's relationship to the world, in the case of Judaism, Torah. Most people are satisfied there can be a God so long as God minds his or her own business, okay? But not to interfere in the affairs of state or the affairs of people. Okay, there's a God, let's keep moving, we don't have to worry about that. That is the theology, I would say that was the founding theology of the Republic. Once there was a United States, as opposed to the colonies, there was a big shift in communal arrangement. Remember, the numbers were very low. In the colonial period, every community that existed here, there were only 5, a few thousand people, had a single communal structure. It was a form of communalism, and it was based on the doctrine of deference. That is, that the rich ruled the community. It was a colonial society, and people deferred, which is a technical term, to the aristocrats. We have never gotten past that. Like I say, class is an important discussion in analyzing the American Jewish experience. We have a palpable tension in the American Jewish community since the time of the Revolution, from elite control of the major Jewish organizations and the bottom-up principles of democracy. So the elite feel they have to be participants in order to be in charge, because as the aristocrats, that is their noblesse oblige, that is their responsibility, reflecting almost at least 200 years ago a kind of belief that that was the natural order of things. With the American Revolution and independence, the community, the Kehillah, Kedoshah, which existed in the 5 original communities, broke up, and the idea of communalism was replaced with congregationalism. Congregationalism is a specific polity of religious community organization. Episcopal is not just a kind of church, but it means control by the clergy. Congregationalism means control by the congregation and not the clergy, and the presbyter is in between, where it's kind of joint rule by clergy and lay people alike. In America, after the Revolution, in a country that was intoxicated with democracy, congregationalism became the main principle of Jewish, organized Jewish religious life in the United States. It was religion of, by, and for the people. If the trustees of a congregation declared that in their synagogue, blue would be called red, then in that synagogue, blue would be called red. And if the rabbi said you're wrong, then the rabbi would be out, because of the power of congregationalism in America. These synagogues in the early part of the 19th century then invented one of the great American contributions to the history of organized Judaism, annual dues. Annual dues were invented in 1824 in Charleston, South Carolina. The young group of Jews in Beth Elohim congregation felt that the auctioning of honors was unseemly. It was bad manners, and instead we should have annual dues. They were a young Sephardic group. They petitioned the board, which was properly called a junta at the time, and it was thrown into the garbage can. But it came to pass that in America and its Protestantized culture, and you're not supposed to talk about religion and money, that annual dues actually came into effect for better or for worse. The contribution of East European Jews. We tend to romanticize East European Jewish life. There is a reason that they left Russia and Romania. It was muddy, it was cold, it was violent, there was little prospect of getting ahead. They come here to America, and besides a strong sense of peoplehood, what they bring is Jewish secularism. They bring a strong tradition of Jewish secularism to America. If you roll the clock back 100 years ago, what were the most powerful organizations in the Jewish community that took care of people? Unions. Unions sent people to the theater on Friday night, where they sat and cried over plays on Shabbos that they no longer observed themselves, but missed it because they saw it up in the stage. They had union meetings decrying religion, and then afterwards somebody said, "I'm saying Kaddish, could we have a minyan?" So it was the kind of mixed up Jewish experience of modernity. Ethnicity is what prevailed, in my opinion, among East European Jews. It's a form of a denationalized Jewish identity. What becomes of a national group transplanted to America, they become ethnic. And in America, they even had to invent their own foods to prove it. Jews did not eat lox in East Europe. Where would they possibly have gotten salmon? In Poland, and there weren't that many cousins in Norway to send it to them. They invented it here in the United States. Ethnicity was the way that Jews understood each other. That's why the Jewish community centers came into being. It's why we had the phenomena back in particular in the 30s of what were called mushroom synagogues. Mushroom synagogues, like mushrooms on your front lawn, for those of you who are suburban, come up and stay for a little bit and disappear. A mushroom synagogue was run by an entrepreneur who had a rabbi and a cantor in his pocket, rented a movie theater, opened business Rosh Hashanah, closed at Nila and Yom Kippur. People made it to the holidays, and that's the way people could check in. They could buy what they needed. With World War II and suburbanization, religious Judaism takes on a new place in the Jewish community, a Jewish community that had never really embraced Judaism as a religion. This was the Cold War, and all these union people had to make sure that they weren't going to get on McCarthy's list, so they joined religious institutions, got into the inside, opened up the prayer book and said, "What is this? When's the bowling league meet? I need to do something that I really enjoy." So American Jews in the suburbs discovered the synagogue because of the place of religion in general in American society, but particularly during the early Cold War, and they begin to bring things from American society to their synagogue. What is the most important thing about the synagogue of the post-war period? It is the children, that the children are no longer going to learn about Jewishness from living in a Jewish neighborhood. I once read an op-ed piece in Boston about an Irish American who lamented the fact when he grew up, he had 500 cousins within 5 miles. And now his children don't have 5 cousins within 500 miles. They learned their Irishness through the neighborhood and through the family networks, which were gone, and they were replaced by a new kind of institutional setting called the synagogue, which was religious by script. I call it accidental congregants, but the real purpose of it was to create the ethnic markers. To make the situation even more complicated, it's out in the suburbs, and it gets all tied up in the cult of conspicuous consumption. It's not so much that a 13-year-old has a new spiritual relationship with God as its chance to make a full-scale statue out of chopped liver to show that you have really arrived in America and that you have made it in the American dream. If we take a look at 3 different periods, I'll conclude in just a second, get a sense of how this has worked over time cyclically in American history. We're in 2011, so I'm picking 11-year markers on a 100-year basis to illustrate this. In 1811, America was probably at one of its low points in terms of religious activity. It was after the Revolution. It was before the War of 1812. Deism was very, very strong. Church attendance was very, very low. In 1830, America was one of the most religious countries in the world because of the so-called Second Great Awakening. What had changed is still with us today. What had changed was the predominance of a Calvinist theology, which taught you don't really know whether God has saved you or not, with what becomes standard American, general American theology, amazing grace. I know I have been saved. God has spoken to me. Religion becomes a kind of empirical experience. I heard many, many examples of that this morning, which may or may not be part of the historical Jewish experience, since in the Torah it says, you know, if you meet God, you die. And it's a very different kind of approach to religion when you say, I have personally had this experience. There was this change in the direction of the empirical experience after the War of 1812, and it transformed America from a country that was largely anti-religious to a country that had become, they called it the Protestant Empire. Then take the year 1911. What was the condition of religion in America? It was very secular. Fundamentalism, so to speak, had just begun. It's when the pamphlets, the fundamentals, had just been published. The Catholicism was in a very defensive position. Unions dominated the cultural life of the Jewish community. What happened by 1930? The secularism became even deeper. We know from studies, the first bureaus of Jewish education, that an infinitesimal fraction of Jewish children were receiving Jewish education. We know that synagogue membership plummeted. The 20s in general were called a religious recession in America, a religious depression, first because of prosperity, and then during the Depression, nobody could afford to go to synagogue, and the numbers went even lower. What was behind it was a raging secularism and a belief that progress in history was replacing traditional covenant theology. So where are we in 2011, and what is most likely in 2030? My sense, it's a mix of the two scenarios. On the one hand, I would say that the general erosive effects, unlike the first speaker this morning, of secularism and denationalization or de-ethnization, the Jewish community, continue apace and universally are wearing down the majority of the American Jewish community. But within that world, there are pockets of renewal, but only pockets of renewal, which suggests a very ancient theology in the Jewish experience, which is the saving remnant. In the ancient days, a prophet like Isaiah taught it might not be possible to save the whole people, but a saving remnant might emerge, which will carry forth Jewish identity into the distant future. The question then becomes, which of the ideas in play today and which of the programs today are going to take root to maintain at least a saving remnant of Jews and Judaism here in America?
I'm going to speak from a different perspective than my colleague, and we spoke before together. He speaks of history and of reality and what is, and I'm going to speak a little bit about what remains eternal and what we're hoping for. And I think together we'll have a very rich dialogue. First of all, certain things don't change, and I think the need for belonging is something that endures. It takes many forms, and it's met in different ways. Family constellations may change dramatically, but the wish to be part of a family endures. Witness the push for gay marriage. People may say families can be made up of different partners, but there is a wish for enduring ties of great depth. The form and makeup of our congregations and Jewish organizations may change, but the yearning to be part of a collective of highly meaningful relationships that inspire hope does not. And I think we also need to remember that identity is formed in the context of relationships of strong affective bonds, primarily in families. So as we look at Jewish peoplehood as being part of a family, and we look at our congregations and organizations, and we have the vision of wanting people to feel that they are families, we also have to remember then that people struggle with ambivalence inside of families. No? So we shouldn't mistake the heady intoxication that congregants may feel, and people feel who claim that the synagogue is irrelevant, and that they are so glad to be freed from relationships that were unsatisfying for an actual rejection of commitment and relationship. Contemporary Jews may be are not really showing a disinterest in belonging. If we perceive ourselves as family, then think for a moment of not the families on high, but the families we actually live in and have grown up in and create. Much as we may love our families, don't we seek distance when we hear too much about how we don't visit enough? That we only come for the holidays? Don't we seek distance when we hear a lot of requests for money? And when we're told we don't give enough priority to our families when we're choosing how to spend our time? Let's look at which aspects of belonging are sustainable and most vital and determine how to cultivate them so that we create communal structures that do function like good families, ones that give places for deeply meaningful connections but also offer opportunities for freedom and growth. Again, while we have certainly had a culture characterized by rapid-fire change and all of the historical influences are very real, fundamental biological and psychological human needs for belonging are enduring. And remember, belonging and membership are by no means identical. Membership is often assigned, an accident of birth or adoption, and in some cases, membership may be acquired simply by paying a fee, donating, or enrolling. Sometimes membership is hard-won or chosen, as in religious conversion, naturalization, election, or even acceptance after a competitive process of selection. But belonging is never easily achieved. It's different from membership, even when obstacles to membership are great. To develop a sense of belonging, and we need to remember this as we create new avenues for Jewish affiliation, repeated experiences of significant emotional connection need to occur over a fairly long period of time. Otherwise, you don't feel you belong. We may convert to Judaism, we may join a synagogue, be accepted into a university, even marry into a family, and still feel that we don't truly belong. So let's look at the evidence of why Judaism and Jewish community still has a vital role to play. In our history, personal, communal, and religious, belonging has been linked to survival. From infancy through old age, we need to feel we belong, or we may literally perish. When we're infants, even if the rudiments of care are provided, including food, sleep, even human contact and affection, cuddling, babies are liable to die if they're not specifically attached to people who cherish them. And this is something we need to look at when we think of whether our connections to religion and to organizations also mirror those powerful connections. Needs may be met, but if they are not accompanied by ties of affection, something essential is lost. Attachment and belonging are the absolute ground on which all else is built. Important to remember that a sense of belonging in early family life has a neuroprotective benefits. In other words, the brain really is formed in the context of relationships, and our brain will show the evidence of this as we go through life. And ongoing experiences of belonging and feeling cherished continue to confer protective and healing effects throughout life. And we're not merely speaking of sentiment here again. We're speaking of the way the brain functions. Children who are insecurely attached respond to upsetting experience ultimately with elevated blood pressure, inability to recover, to self-soothe, and to maintain hope. They don't have a sense of basic trust, which is not just an idea. Their bodies and brains reflect this lack of trust in catastrophic reactions to adversity. Children who felt themselves securely attached, who sense that they belong to parents and to a community to whom they matter deeply, are able to withstand even adverse experiences because of the way their brains have developed. And there is research done in Israel at Herzog Hospital Psychotrauma Center on which children respond in which ways to trauma, and very classic studies done by Anna Freud during World War II when children were separated from parents and from the communities they had been living in and sent out into the countryside during the bombings. They fared more poorly psychologically than the children who remained close to family, close to community, right in London. That the psychological and spiritual sequelae were very severe. And this tendency to respond poorly to stress if our attachments and sense of belonging is shaky early on persists throughout our whole life. That's the bad news. The difficulty with managing stress, maintaining optimism, confronting crises constructively is carried into adult life. Even for those people who have had positive early experiences, the lack of belonging, isolation, and lack of support can be devastating. Witness what happens to people in solitary confinement, in prisons, in detention camps. We can be broken very quickly if we lose our sense of being part of sustained, intimate relationships and communal relationships. Loneliness and social isolation are linked to mortality all throughout our lives. College students are much more liable to depression and suicide in the early days when they have not formed attachments at college, when our lives are affected by divorce, widowhood, outliving peers, living far from grown children, sometimes separated because we go into assisted living or nursing homes or live close to our adult children, from congregations and communities where we raised families. People do not flourish. We crave connections that confirm our sense of being needed. And with the shifting demographic in the Jewish and wider community towards old age, the challenge to sustain that sense of belonging is even greater. The good news, however, is that there is plasticity to the brain and to our capacity to form healing attachments. Even in the face of great adversity and challenge, even in a rapidly changing world, new attachments can foster a sense of belonging and strengthen our capacity to cope. While much of what we will hear today will speak of the plethora of opportunities to have needs met that were previously met by involvement in Judaism and Jewish community, the need to truly belong is one which is not adequately met by any other institutions in our culture. Religious, value-oriented communities continue to offer unique possibilities in a world replete with opportunities for instant contact, but fewer clear pathways to truly enduring, meaningful relationships. Let's see how Judaism can help. Judaism tells a story of belonging. It encodes ways in which we belong to God and to one another. It encourages attachments that build security, meaning, and hope. Our creation stories speak of a God creating human beings to fill a personal void and need. We imagine even God's loneliness and need of humanity, even as we speak of God as having no needs. Whatever we feel about chosenness, we Jews have craved to see ourselves as mattering to God, and have also been sustained by the belief that God has need of us as well. We speak of God as parent, as lover of Israel, as choosing prophets even before their birth, as nourishing and sustaining us. It's always within this context of cherished belonging that responsibilities and obligations are formulated. First, we're cared for in Eden, in the desert. Then, in the context of relationship of mutual love, care, and belonging, we accept guidance about how we might live, how our lives might become holy. Only when our children, our friends, our partners, and our congregants feel certain not that they are members, but that they truly belong, can they hear what might be required of them to sustain satisfying relationships and protect the world. Only when our congregants, our students feel loved, can they truly enter and support a community. Psychoanalyst Anna Maria Rizzuto has spoken of the relationship to God as reflecting both our actual attachments, to our parents, to our early family members, and our sense of belonging to them, as well as our wishes for something better or different than what occurred in our actual families. Judaism then has the opportunity to affect primary ties to parents and also to offer people alternatives in the image of God as a loving parent to whom we belong. My mentor, Rabbi Richard Address, speaks of a theology of relationships, viewing the role of Judaism and Jewish communities as offering opportunities to form important relationships between and among congregants, to clergy, to teachers. When he has interviewed congregants about why they stay, their answer is rarely about services and religion. It is more to do with who they have relationships with, who their children have relationships with. And so to be cut off from such ties surely has always carried in ancient or feudal culture being without protection or sustenance. We know that. But truly the greater danger of living in a world without places to forge sustained relationship then and now, whether it was in ancient times or now, is to be emotionally cut off, to live without a sense of enduring belonging to anyone, without a sense of being rooted in relationships that engender trust. The ancients might not have understood neurobiology, but to be karet, to be cut off, was to court psychic and physical disaster. In studies done by Cohn and Eisen, they discovered that those who stayed involved also often did so because of their powerful relationships within congregations and Jewish organizations, and because they were offered a place to meditate and reflect, to simply be in a place of deep connection. That's what we need at the earliest moments of our life, to simply be at peace in a place of connection. That's what we talked about spiritually this morning, and that is belonging. In the book Bowling Alone and the second book, American Grace, Harvard scholar Putnam speaks about the fact, and this is really important when we speak about membership, that it is worse to be a worshiper with no friends. If you're in a community and you come every week and you have no friends, psychologically, you suffer more than if you didn't come at all. That's really powerful news. And anyone who has ever watched or been the person who stood alone at an oneg after services knows exactly how lonely that can be. To be in a supposedly sacred space where prayers and food are offered, remember, when you get your basic needs met, but fellowship is not. The person who attends services but feels she has no friends may even be a member. She may pay her dues, but she certainly doesn't feel she belongs. People will give up membership when they are assessing their financial and time commitments. They will not so easily dispense with belonging. We are talking about the answers to these questions. Who hears my voice? Who would truly miss me as an individual if I were not here? Whose eyes light up when I arrive? Who will help me when I'm dejected and discouraged? Who needs what I have to offer? We're talking about that which enables us to feel in some way at home in the world. That's belonging. But we have to raise the question about whether congregations and Jewish communal organizations are currently serving enough as places to nourish sacred relationships that offer a deep sense of belonging and that engender emotional and spiritual health. Surely it's our intention to create those communities. So if and where it's not happening, why not? And that's what the questions we're going to ask together today. I'm going to speak a bit about it. We will dialogue. The need to belong is ubiquitous for optimal development. But let's think about this. We see this as therapists, as clergy, as educators daily. Difficulty in making and sustaining attachments is another thing again. Because people have difficulty making attachments, we should not then base on that our assumption that they don't need to belong. We must see that that difficulty creates psychological and spiritual trouble. When people can't attach, it's a deficit. Although we may now be connected to thousands through the internet, the yearning for emotionally powerful face-to-face contact is often what fuels all of the internet dating services. The internet can and is used for anonymous encounters, no question, and of course for the exchange of information. But in the realm of human relations, it's valued for the capacity to search out and reinforce opportunities for belonging. It's not an end in itself. Skype and other video chat platforms are most often used as was the telephone, which was, when it was invented, would the whole world be connected? No. People used it to call their family and people in close proximity. Skype and other platforms are used to connect college students to their parents, people having long-distance romances to one another, grandparents to their grandchildren. They're used as bridges to connect those who already belong to one another, not as destinations. We are most certainly seeking reduced distance and less isolation, but not anonymity and serial, short-lived connections. Nobody would want to keep their relationship Skype-based. No one would raise a child through a video chat room. We need also to ask why people are sometimes online. Somebody has that idea? It might be good, yeah? It's tempting. We also need to ask why people are sometimes online. Okay, they're always online. We acknowledge that. But it's often because they're lonely, depressed, addicted, seeking connection, precisely because of the absence of attachments and capacity to find relief and soothing in spiritually more deep ways, in relationally more deep ways. They are seeking help. Yes, they are. WebMD with worries about health, relationship, and even faith. You can ask it anything. Should I break up with my boyfriend? Should I do that? You can ask Google any question and you'll get answers. But these answers will never, and these problems will never be assuaged by shallow relationship and short fixes. It's like the alcoholic who reaches for a drink, the overeater for a cookie, the porn addict for an image online. There's a momentary relief followed by distress, an attempt to soothe it again with the same inadequate means. It's never the same as really connecting to a person. And more, electronic and internet stimulation may even produce neurological changes, much in the way addictions do. People may come to crave something that offers short-lived sense of relief and well-being, return to a state, as I said, of unsatisfied, unsoothed tension, and yet reach and want the same something, leaving deep needs unmet. We may benefit, and again, I think, and I hope we can discuss this further, and I think we're at our peril if we offer such fixes with Jewish labels, when true relationships and accompaniment that constitute belonging is what is needed, even if the person can't name the longing. This is not to say we don't use the internet, but we look to whether our goal is to use this to weave relationships. Here it matters again that strong attachments are indeed sustained by parallel community structures, and they offer protections. In essence, if our organizations, our teaching, and everything we offers opportunity for sustained contact with people over time, we provide, in essence, we are training the brain so that there is an alternative to the kinds of experiences that are stimulating but put us in jeopardy. Remember, people do not only use the net to play games or get information. They are desperately searching not just to hear you are connected, but to find people with whom to have real-time relationships. Think of adopted, traumatized kids we hear of who have difficulty making attachments. Yes, we meet them where they are, but our goal is always to help them find special satisfaction in unique, long-standing relationships, and that's the role of Jewish community as well. They offer an unusual opportunity in that we don't graduate from them. It's not like school or a country club or anything else. You can be in a Jewish community throughout your life, and you can find an approximation of it to join again in another community. But if the community, and here is where I think our important questions are, is not actually fostering connections and sense of belonging, because it's inadvertently causing members and potential members to feel like outsiders, because their knowledge and beliefs and identity are not validated, because the person can't feel cherished as he or she is, then the person's sense of belonging will be eroded and membership is devalued. Being a member of a group to which you don't really feel you belong is absolutely psychologically detrimental, and it doesn't foster emotional or spiritual growth. On top of this, if the very same group conveys messages that interfere, and listen carefully here, with other primary attachments, such as between spouses who are intermarried, between grandparents and their children not being raised Jewish, then people will move away from the organization to protect primary attachments. They will join more welcoming churches. They may eschew religious affiliation. They may live devoid of connections that might have been meaningful. The absence may not show up. They may say they're fine. They may look fine until those moments of strain when the sense of belonging that is strengthening is most needed. If one's sense of the divine and the spiritual is not addressed or welcomed within the Jewish community, people will search elsewhere. It's not that they're not interested, but they will search elsewhere rather than to continue to feel that they can find no sense of belonging or comfort. The droves of people pursuing yoga, Buddhism, some sense of Kabbalah, all attest, not in synagogues, all attest to longing for something spiritual which is not so dissonant that they cannot belong. So much of what is offered in a watered-down form in these places is also truly part of our own spiritual tradition, but many of our members have little access to this until they are truly in pain and need them. It's not part of what they're learning regularly. And let's also look at the wish for officiation at life cycle events, because as Rabbi Sussman has said, this is something people still want. But life cycle moments are times of stress, change, and emotional vulnerability. That should tell us something. What is being sought is an affirmation of attachments through a connection to the possibility of heaven, to ancestors, to ritual, to all things that will strengthen the sense that the person born, the growing child, the teen, the beloved, even the deceased are individuals to whom all must be done to acknowledge belonging. It is a stamp of belonging when we have such ceremonies, and at times of stress we need it. People come for these life cycle events and then leave, often because their ongoing experiences are not ones that promote that same sense of deep belonging to community or to one another. We laugh when they come to great Shabbats and even pet Shabbats, but we need to take seriously that those are personal and they feel related to the lives they're living. They come to healing services too. And what about non-belief as undermining membership? I think this is important because as a therapist and as a rabbi in a pastoral capacity, we need to acknowledge that belief is a fluid thing. As our sense of God and also of others to whom we are attached, in the sick room, on the battlefield, on a roller coaster. Anybody see the YouTube of the kid calling, Ma, Ma? Did anybody see that? A kid terrified on a roller coaster. He looked about 20, screaming, Ma, Ma. Do you think he'd call his mother when he was in danger? No. There are no people who don't love their mother on a roller coaster, just like there are no atheists in the foxhole. Okay? Even if at other moments we'd say, my mother, she was inadequate. What did she really do for me? And the same way people say that about God. Okay. In other words, people need to feel a sense of belonging to God and the possibility offered to them, even if they tell you they don't believe in God, because the need to belong is stirred up most strongly at times of regression and pain.
Does the need to belong alone constitute enough of a principle to maintain the Jewish community? I doubt it. I think it's a universal need that will be met in many different ways. A true story, earlier this year, one of the men who serves as an usher in my synagogue and has voluntarily taken on the onerous task of ushering bar and bat mitzvah services, willingly deals with masses of 13-year-olds, came to me and told me that his daughter was engaged, mazel tov, Jewish guy, double mazel tov, and there's a problem. I said, well, what's wrong? They said, well, they're not interested in you doing the wedding. I said, well, that's okay. Well, what's going on here? She said, well, my daughter said she was confirmed the year before you arrived at the synagogue, and she doesn't know you, and they want somebody that they really know to officiate at the wedding. I said, great. And the dad said, well, the person they really know is a kid they went to school with who became a Presbyterian minister. So the need to be attached sometimes can supersede the need to attach the Jewish community, and I think it's a pretty serious challenge for us when there are so many possibilities of attaching in so many different places. It's one of the greatest challenges I think we face as a community.
A congregant came in and said, I was new to the congregation, and said that she wanted her daughter and her family to really know me. So she brought me lunch and came with her daughter every day for 6 weeks. And she invited me to her home, and finally, because she was a really very lovely and funny woman, I said to her, do we know each other well enough? You know, I think your daughter wants to eat lunch with somebody else. And we did. And by the time we were on the bima, we did know one another. I guess part of what this speaks to is that for people to feel a sense of belonging may mean smaller congregations, smaller groupings where people are really known. And I do think, again, membership falls when sense of belonging falls. Ginny Thornburg, who is the wife of the former governor of Pennsylvania and who also is enormously active in the disabilities movement, speaks of her son, the governor's son, and her son, who is disabled and lives in a group home. And she asked him, why does he always like to go to church? And he said, because at church everyone knows my name. If no one knows our name in our organizations, I don't think we can then determine they're not interested in belonging. We got to look to how we change that. I would also add to what Rabbi Sussman has said, that we need to find people who want to belong. What do I mean by that? That the disenfranchised, we have often been the place, the Abraham who leaves because he can't relate to his father's idols, Hannah who's on the steps of the temple because whispering prayers because she can't find a place. Our new communities may be reaching out to people who don't yet feel that they can belong in what exists. And those, I was an intern at the Gay and Lesbian Synagogue. When you're at a place at a time when people don't feel they're welcome somewhere else, you don't have to convince them to come. So who are we reaching out to?
As you made a wonderful distinction, important between belonging and membership. I find innumerable cases what they're dropping is membership, not belonging. The crisis comes, the funeral comes, they're back, and then you have an institutional problem. Do you serve the needs of a non-member? We've got to pay for the electricity, got to pay salary and all that. Or do you take care of the genuine human needs for a funeral or whatever it is? What comes first? How to handle that? My answer is you take care when the call comes in. You have to triage based on the human need. If you're lucky, they come back. And if you're not lucky institutionally, hopefully you did a good job in helping them.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you both for a provocative conversation.